Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. For the last 3 to 4 years, I've been battling with the question behind me. The majority of deer farms in the UK are born out of diversification projects and have become intensive due to financial pressures. We are then dealing with an animal which is semi-wild or semi-domesticated. There are 4 key times of the year when that animal's natural behaviours and natural cycles have the biggest influence on our management and productivity. Calving, weaning, the rut, and winter housing is the 4th. So a brief bit of history. Deer farming started here in the UK and in New Zealand in the late 1970s, early 1980s, with wild capture of deer off the open hill and relocation of deer out of historic deer parks. The most popular type of deer or species of deer for commercial venison is the red deer. The same red deer you'll find on the Scottish Highlands and on Exmoor down the road. Followed by that is its close cousin, the Canadian elk, really for its terminal sire abilities. We are an incredibly small industry. In the UK, there's approximately 100 deer farms farming 35 to 40,000 deer. Compare that to New Zealand. There's about 800,000 deer farmed, and they're exporting 12,000 tonnes of venison a year. As a UK industry, we're producing around 10,000 prime animals for slaughter a year, and the majority of those are working their way into Waitrose and Marks and Spencers. We are also one of the only livestock sectors, I believe, in the world that has a wild competition. The wild competition in the UK at the moment looks at around 2 million wild deer and an annual cull of 350,000 deer entering the food chain. That figure is likely to increase to nearly 500,000 over the next few years. So the deer farming year. There's approximately 2 to 2.5 ewes to a red hind. We're possibly comparable to a spring calving suckler herd, to give you some idea. But we're dealing with an animal that goes through huge peaks and troughs of testosterone levels and hormone levels. Red stags are also one of the only animals to shed a limb every spring. Their antler falls off. It regrows then over the summer at 1 inch a day approximately, until it turns into hard antler at the end of the summer and is technically bone at that point. So where did I go on my travels? I visited Canada, and in Canada I looked at elk farms, whitetail farms, bison farms, extensive beef operations, cattle feedlots, and their salmon industry. I visited Spain. I went to Los Lomas, the largest deer farm in Europe, and one which carries out extensive AI work and embryo work. I visited the Czech Republic and the University of Life Science, where they've had a 30-year research project on rutting red stag behaviour. Obviously, I had to go to New Zealand and see some of their 800,000 deer and some of their salmon industry. I also carried out surveys and visits in the UK of deer farms, and I visited poultry units, pig units, and zoos. So going back to the 4 key times of the year when those natural behaviours have the biggest impact. I'm just going to touch on each of them really quickly, and then we'll move on. So calving. Deer are referred to as hiders. They give birth, they leave the calf, and they return to it throughout the day feeding it. They'll do this for about a 7 to 10 day window before the calf stays with mum. Calving environment is absolutely key to calf survival. Although we lose all our lovely rotational grazing and cell grazing through calving, it's a great tool for us to be able to improve calving environment. Visiting deer milking units as well in New Zealand, I understand the importance of understanding how hinds lactate and improving lactation to maximise the growth rate of that calf while it's with mum. Weaning. Obviously a hugely stressful time for any livestock animal when it's weaned. The majority of deer farmers are seeing the best ways of weaning using the Atkins theory of returning weaned stock back to fields that they're familiar with. Oh, sorry. We can, with deer, take the advantage of doing a pre-rut wean, which is the most common type of wean, or we can leave it even for a natural wean 8 to 10 months of age, although impacting potentially on conception. The rut. Obviously in the autumn, big testosterone-fueled stags. In the Czech Republic, they've proven that mature red stags in the rut can dominate young stags in the field next door and will even dominate mature elk bulls next door, all meaning hinds can miss cycles, forcing later conception and later born calves the following year. So winter housing. I found myself looking at winter housing quite heavily for my report, really. Going against maybe a lot of what the regenerative movement is, winter housing is actually gaining popularity in deer farming. It's been commonplace in the UK for deer farmers to house their young stock in the first winter of their life. In recent years, more people have started to house adult red hinds. In New Zealand, where they barely house any stock, there's an increase in people putting up barns to house adult red deer. The main reason for this is environmental reasons: soil compaction, soil runoff, soil erosion, followed then really by public perception. The issue is we're dealing with, like I say, a wild animal which is basically habituated to a farm environment. They're also an animal that's very strong in social structure, and this leads to, when you put them into a shed, huge social problems. Bullying. Really. They are horrible to each other, really, is what I'm saying. So I found myself looking at this bullying issue, which is almost a welfare issue, really, when you start housing stock. And really I identified 7 key points to help us reduce bullying going forward. So enrichment. Zoos are fantastic at enrichment for clever animals, and I've saw some great examples. Deer respond well to enrichment, but the enrichment does need to be changed, certainly weekly at max. And we need to find commercial enrichment techniques. I think we underestimate bedding up stock daily, what a good enrichment practice that is. Space, pretty obvious really. The more space you give something, the better it does. The current recommendations that were put together in the early 1990s recommend 3 square metres per adult hind. In the last few years, we've sort of highlighted we need to give our hinds 6 square metres and above to see reduction in bullying. And time. In New Zealand, they're starting to house a lot of adult red stags, approximately for 8 weeks pre-antler drop, all governed towards their velvet industry, which is the removal of antler at a certain point in growth. In the UK, we're obviously housing stock for up to 6 months. So if we can look to reduce our housing time, we will see a reduction in bullying. Grouping. Looking at the pig industry and also using body condition as a proxy for dominance, we should be grouping animals based on that body condition rather than anything else. How am I doing for time? Oh, diet. Again, looking at the poultry industry, where it was quickly highlighted to me that increasing fibre in the diet reduces feather pecking. As a deer industry and deer farmers, we're probably underestimating our feed rations and our diets that we're feeding our deer. Increasing the fibre is probably key. And space. Visiting cattle feedlots in Canada, most of them are working to 25 centimetres per cow at the feed frontage. That's the optimum size, they say, for productivity. In the deer world, this is directly related to diet, really. Deer have an incredibly small mouth, so we have to look at intake rates and how quickly that animal can fill up. Ideally, we would work on 100% feed space, but we have to work at 75% feed space at minimum for that mob. And shed design. I haven't looked heavily at shed design really because the majority of people actually are using converted cattle sheds and similar ideas. But deer are definitely more content in sheds where the visibility is great, and a combination of outdoor space and indoor space is really helpful to reduce social problems. So in conclusion, I stand here now more confused than I was 3 years ago, with another 1,000 questions, enough work for a PhD student for about 40 years. But the biggest question I'm asking myself is actually whether we should be farming red deer at all, which is really tough as a deer farmer, you know. I think in answering that question, I think we do need to farm deer. We do need to have a consistent, traceable product, which is healthy and incredibly nutritionally dense. We do, though, need to make sure that our farming system we select suits the part of the world we're in. We then need to look at the type of animal we are putting into that system to make it work. There's also huge lessons to be learned from the salmon industry, which is one of the only other livestock industries that has both a wild and a farmed counterpart. So I'm nearly out of time, but this wouldn't be possible at all without the kind sponsorship of the Studley College Trust and Nuffield for giving me the opportunity. I've got to thank my wife and family for really just putting up with me, and my fellow 2021 scholars for all the support they've given me. Thank you.